Hey everyone, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today for this session on ArcGIS Enterprise and SSL considerations. I'm joined here with my colleague Bill Major, who is a lead developer on the notebook server team, and myself, I am a solution engineer on our national government team. So let's take a look at some of the things we're going to talk about today. First, we want to talk about some common SSL problems, things that you see while you're out there in your environments that give you problems that you need to troubleshoot. Just to sort of set the stage as to, hey, why are we having this session and what is it that we want to achieve and what are some of the problems that we see out there that we want to fix. We're then going to get to the basics of things. We're going to talk about some of the fundamentals of secure communication. We'll talk about how we implement SSL at the web tier on our web servers. And then ultimately, we'll look at some of the SSL implementations directly within ArcGIS Enterprise. So let's talk about some of those common problems, those things that you regularly see. How many of you have ever seen this one where you have browser issues? Everything loads nicely in one particular browser like Chrome, but then we try to load the same site in Firefox and we get a number of warnings from our browser. Or how about the opposite? Chrome throws warnings, but everything loads just fine in Firefox. Anyone ever have a situation where they're adding a layer to the map viewer? We're ready to access that layer, and then we run into errors. All right. That's a very common one that we see. And finally, I know one that Bill and I have run across many times in our travels is where we are trying to federate an ArcGIS server to a portal instance, and federation goes fine, but we end up with a grayed out option for setting a hosting server. So these are some of the common things that we see, and we're hoping that throughout today, we'll be able to help you find resolution to some of these common problems and get a better understanding of SSL in general. And what we've done throughout the course of this presentation is added a lock symbol in the upper right-hand corner for the specific slides that give solutions to these problems that we've presented here today. So we wanted to set the stage, give you some problems, and then show you resolution to them as we build on some of the basics and fundamentals and configuration options within ArcGIS Enterprise. Okay, let's get started and talk about the fundamentals of secure communication. When we're talking about secure communication, we're referring to SSL, which is essentially a standard security technology for establishing an encrypted link between a web server and a browser. And although we talk about this in terms of SSL, that's actually an older implementation, and we still just use that term to refer to it, but the specific implementation nowadays is TLS, and the latest version is 1.2 as well as 1.3. From the perspective of secure communication, it's certificate authorities that establish trust by digitally signing server certificates for for server identification and issuing user certificates for client identification. And at the end of the day, what this is about is using public and private keys and pairs for encrypted communication. So a certificate authority is also what we refer to as the root of trust. It's these CAs that establish this trust, and what we have are certificates that live both on the server side and the client side that establish trust with that certificate authority. So we know our server trusts the CA as well as all of our clients trust the CA. Everything begins with that certificate authority or that root of trust. Now, what we will often see is something called intermediate certificate authorities. So moving beyond what we just saw in our previous slide here, and now we have a situation where a certificate authority has delegated the ability to sign certificates to an intermediate certificate authority. But to trust that intermediate CA, we need to trust its root certificate as well as our certificate authorities, the root certificate authorities root certificate. So it's something that we call a trust chain. So having those chains in place from the CA to the intermediate CA, and all those things need to be in place, again, both on our server side and our client side for that trust to be established. So establishing trust for encrypted communication here works this way. Our certificate authority has issued a server certificate for our server here. We know our client machines trust this certificate authority, so therefore we're able to have trusted and encrypted communication between the server and the client. Because we explicitly trust these certificate authorities, it's important that they are always on the lookout for certificates that might have become compromised. So to this end, a certificate authority will actually keep track of what's called a certificate revocation list. And so in this case, when we try to establish communication between a server and a client, and we go out, we actually will make a check for that certificate revocation list. And if we find that that server certificate has been revoked, we'll get a nice browser warning here that will say, hey, this server certificate has been revoked. You don't want to trust this server. And it's important that the certificate authority does this, right? Because we trust the certificates that they are signing. So it's incumbent upon them to maintain this list in case a certificate has ever become compromised. Now, we talked about our clients and our servers trusting a certificate authority. Now, where is that done? How do we know where that is on our machine? Well, a trust store is actually something that lives on our machines. And here's a couple examples of where we can find those. So on Windows, we can access the trust store using the Microsoft Management Console. And we can get in here, and in the screenshot, what we're actually seeing is a small snippet of the trusted root certificate authorities that my machine trusts. So any servers that have had certificates signed by these certificate authorities, I will trust. For those of you on Macs, there's a similar paradigm for that. It's actually called keychain access, and that is just the trust store that's on a Mac. Okay, so same idea, a list of root certificates that we trust explicitly. Now, from a browser perspective, because that's often where we see this, from the Internet Explorer and Chrome side of things, they will actually trust the Windows Trust Store. So if we're loading up either of those browsers, they will look to the trust store that is on your machine to establish trust with a web server. And the same is true on keychain access with Macs. Obviously, this is Chrome only since IE isn't there. Now, Firefox actually has its own trust store. It's managed completely independent of the operating system. So that's something to think about as you're looking at different sites and maybe getting different responses between different browsers. So if we come back to our initial problems here, we've just answered one of those problems there and figured out the solution to it, where we've seen a situation where Chrome will trust a site, but Firefox will not. What we now know is that they have different trust stores, and so in this case, when this happens, it is likely that Firefox simply doesn't trust the certificate authority that has signed that particular site. And so if we look at that, here's our issue and how it's been solved, that we have a missing trust chain in place here. Firefox uses its own trust store. And we have some troubleshooting tips and tricks here. A queue should come up. Hey, if it works in Chrome but not Firefox, if you ever inspect the certification path of a certificate, and it looks unique there, we have that in air quotes. Maybe it's a certificate authority that doesn't sound familiar to you. That could be a good indication that maybe you're missing that trust chain. Okay, so here's an example in my screenshots here where we're using the website from the Naval Research Laboratory, and we can see that in my case, this has been signed by a Department of Defense certificate authority, and there's actually an intermediate certificate in there. So in this scenario, my machine trusts those, but I haven't imported that path into Firefox, and hence the problems that we're seeing. So if we wanted to fix it, we could put both the root certificate and the intermediate certificate authority in the Firefox Trust Store, and then everything would load up fine in Firefox. Okay, so there's an example of that. All right, so let's take a quick tour of those. We'll do this very briefly so you can get an idea of these things and where they're at. So we're going to move out of our presentation for a moment. And I'm going to come to my Start menu, and I'm going to type MMC to open up the Microsoft Management Console. And we're going to go ahead and add a snap-in, and we're going to add the certificate snap-in. There are different variations of this. I want to look at the one that is for my computer, and we'll say OK here. And I want to open this up just quickly and look at the Trusted Root Certification Authorities. And so what we will see is a list of those CAs out there that my machine, and therefore that we just learned that Internet Explorer and Chrome will trust. Okay, so we know that those are there, and then also we can see our intermediate certificate authorities that are in here as well. Okay, so that's my machine, and then therefore Chrome and IE. However, let's go ahead and bring up Firefox. And I want to get into the options for Firefox. And we look under Privacy and Security. And we'll come down here to its Trust Store. And under the Authorities tab, I'm going to scroll through here quickly. And I think you'll notice right away that there are a whole host of other certificate authorities in here that are not available on my operating system. And so it stands to reason that not all the sites that Firefox would trust would Chrome and IE trust, and vice versa, because those are two different trust stores. So hopefully that's a little trick to help you in your troubleshooting and understand why sometimes you have issues connecting to different web servers. Okay. Let's hop back over to our presentation here. And let's talk about implementing SSL at the web tier. So what do we know about setting up certificates on our web servers? We know for sure that some organizations altogether will mandate no HTTP. They require you to be using HTTPS all the time, and you need to have a properly signed server certificate, so no self-signed certificates. What we also know about web servers is by default, your web servers only communicate over HTTP. So to get it to communicate over HTTPS, we need to do some work on our end. And to do that, we need to obtain that CA signed server certificate and then configure our web server to use it. So let's walk through that process. I like to look at this from a couple different perspectives because I think, I know we all operate on different environments and on using different web servers and different operating systems. So I have a couple sets of screenshots here. We're going to look at setting this up on a Windows machine using IIS as a web server, as well as setting up Tomcat on a Linux machine. And you'll see here that while the processes, the actual button clicks are different, the process itself is generally the same. And so understanding that process is very important because then you can abstract this to do with any type of web server that might be out there. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a certificate signing request, or what we call a CSR for short. Up top is a screenshot of that in IIS on Windows, and on the bottom, a couple of screenshots of what that looks like for Tomcat on Linux. Now, one other note here is that what happens behind the scenes in IIS is actually creating a private key that we have behind the scenes, and that is sort of hidden to us as users. On the Tomcat side, that's actually an explicit step you take. So we could really think of this first step as creating a private key and a certificate signing request is probably the more appropriate way to look at this. One thing I would like you to know is that while we're looking at this from these two different perspectives, there's actually many ways that you can create a certificate signing request. You can do it from many of your web servers. You can use open source tools like OpenSSL or KeyTool. And actually, even the administrative pages from Portal and ArcGIS Server have the ability to create CSRs. As a matter of fact, they're using KeyTool under the hood to accomplish that. One thing that Bill and I always like to note here is that the common name property within your CSR, within that creation, that's actually the URL by which your web server is going to be accessed. So if you're ever unsure what that input is, when you see something like common name, or here on our screen we can see the Tomcat will ask you what's your first and last name. That's just the URL by which we're accessing the website. Next up, we go ahead and take our certificate signing request and we will present that to a certificate authority. This process will look a little bit different depending on whether your CA is internal or external, but nonetheless, we take that information and we are going to go ahead and present it to a certificate authority. Okay, and in my screenshots here, you can see we're using some base 64 encoded text, and then we are specifying a couple of attributes here. And one of those key attributes that we want to be sure to specify is the subject alternative name. So there's some syntax there on the screen that shows you how to do that. And this is something that is actually required now by most major browsers, and in particular Chrome, that you have that attribute of a subject alternative name on your server certificate. Once you have presented that to the certificate authority, you're then going to go ahead and download it. And then finally, you're going to install and configure it on your web server. And again, just two different perspectives here. On the left, using a Windows-based workflow, and on the right, a command line-based workflow on Linux. Okay, and so these are these steps here now where we're binding this to the traffic on 443. And now when we're done, we get those nice green locks, or excuse me, the nice locks there that we're used to seeing in our browsers that tell us that we have secure and trusted communication across those URLs. And if you recall, we've now solved another problem. In the beginning, we talked about, hey, Chrome is throwing us warnings, but the site loads fine in Firefox. And we have uncovered why that is. And so if we're talking about this scenario where Chrome is throwing us a problem, it's likely the cause is a missing subject alternative name in our server certificate. That is something that recent releases of Chrome have enforced, and it is something that is required to be included in your when you present your CSR to your certificate authority. And from a troubleshooting tips and tricks perspective, the best way to uncover this is to always expose the advanced options in Chrome when you see that warning. And of course, another clue here is if the site loads fine in Firefox, but not in Chrome, because Firefox doesn't enforce this requirement yet. All right, so let's step out of our PowerPoint again here and just walk through enabling HTTPS on a web server, just to give you an idea of how quick and easy this can be. So in my case, we're going to go ahead and use IIS. We'll do this right here on my laptop. And we're going to come to our server certificates, and we're going to see we don't have one just yet. And so what that means is if we were to look at my website locally here on my machine, we're able to hit it over HTTP. So we know here just to put that in the browser, HTTP loads up fine. But if we came across HTTPS, the site isn't going to load because we don't have a signed certificate there yet. So let's walk through the process here. We're going to go ahead and create that certificate request. That's the first step. And we're going to put in the required attributes. We're going to specify the bit length here for our encryption. And we're going to go and save our file off. So give this a name. And now the next step in our process will be to present this to a certificate authority. So in my case, we're going to say request a certificate, and we're going to submit this over base64. So we just need to grab our file here and grab the text. And we're going to say this is a web server for our template, and we don't want to forget our subject alternative name. Oops. And we'll go ahead and submit that. And we're going to now download it. And we're going to complete our certificate request here in IIS. And we're just going to browse out to our certificate. And we're going to specify to store this in our web hosting. And we're almost complete. So now we've gone out, we've made our CSR, we've presented that to our CA. We have brought that response back to our web server. And now the final piece here is to go ahead and bind the traffic on 443 or HTTPS, that's the common port for that, to our certificate here that we just chose. And once we hit OK, and now let's bring our browser back up. And let's go ahead and reload this page. And now we see that nice lock that we're used to. So there in just a moment, I showed you how quick and simple it could be. The process, while a little different on different operating systems and with different web servers, fundamentally is the same. So once you feel comfortable with those steps, you can do this on any web server that you have available to you. All right. So we have taken a moment there and got ourselves familiar with some of the basics. We looked at some common problems. We enabled this on the web server. But now I want to pass things over to my colleague Bill, who's going to talk to you specifically about implementing SSL within ArcGIS Enterprise.
Okay. Thanks, Craig. Appreciate your running through the first part of this. My name is Bill Majors. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to focus the second half of today's presentation on taking a little bit deeper dive down inside the ArcGIS Enterprise software at this point. Craig has kind of talked a lot about what SSL is and how to do some things at the web tier. We're now going to talk about how you do some things at the application tier with within the software within Portal and ArcGIS Server itself. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so this is just an example, and this is probably some of the pain points that many of you experience is when you have an ArcGIS Enterprise installation, especially one that may be somewhat distributed across many different servers. There are a lot of SSL touch points that you have to take into consideration. As Craig talked about earlier, there's the client web browser and what you're interacting with, which web servers that may have SSL considerations and the proper chains to be trusted. So there's the web server. The web server may communicate with some type of secure LDAP, and in those instances, you got to think about how the web server trusts talking to the secure LDAP. There's how the web server talks to Portal for ArcGIS, how Portal for ArcGIS talks with its federated ArcGIS servers, how it communicates, how Portal may trust or need to trust in order to talk to external ArcGIS servers, which we'll kind of take a look at an example there as well. Even all the way down to the print task on a particular ArcGIS server, where there are some OS types of things that there are some considerations as well. So one of the hard parts is whenever you're implementing an ArcGIS Enterprise environment like this is to understand, what the SSL touch points are so that you can then properly address them in the right locations, okay, in the right areas of your implementation. So this is just an example of understanding that there are many touch points that have to be considered. So one of the first things you need to do is when it comes to securing communication, such as what Craig talked about, is make sure you start at the web server, at the public URL facing web server that your users will be interacting with. This is where you want to put the properly CA signed certificate. This is where your web adapters live, right? So your users are going to come in on some public URL, over 443 or HTTPS. Then the web adapters are going to do their job to proxy those requests to the backend servers correctly over those internal ports. Most of the time, your users will never be communicating directly with 6443 or 7443, but with a web server itself. So this is always the first step. Get your web servers, get properly signed certificates there, because that's what most users will be interacting with. All right. So one of the notes here is that so far, in what we've talked about is installing and configuring properly signed or CA or certificate authority signed certificates at the web tier, and then users interacting with that tier. Therefore, they're going to be using or trusting that signed certificate at the web server. However, there may be times where we need to replace the certificates at the application tier. And what I mean by that is ArcGIS Server or Portal or Data Store, or some of our other server products that are running, that when you install the software, they create self-signed certificates so that they can have an HTTPS port initially to communicate with. There may be times where you need to replace those. Typically, these are for reasons of security, like some security body is enforcing you to make those changes. My recommendation is never change out those self-signed certificates unless you really need to, unless there's some really good reason to do that. But there are times when you need to do that, and what I'm going to walk you through now is how do you change out those certificates if you need to, down at what we call the application tier. Okay. So as I mentioned, Portal for ArcGIS, ArcGIS Server, Data Store, Notebook Server, Mission Server, Web App Builder, Developer Edition. Many products, when you install them, they actually create self-signed certificates that are running those internal SSL ports, right? You got to have a SSL certificate in order to serve out HTTPS. So the only way to do that is we create self-signed certificate as part of our software installs, okay? And typically they take on like the name of the machine or something like that, depending on the environment. However, each one of these self-signed internal certificates can be replaced with a properly signed certificate if you want to. And we're going to walk through that a little bit. So, but again, my recommendation is only ever do this if there's a real need. If there's a real security reason that you're being forced to do that. Otherwise, a lot of our configuration with web adapters and all of that knows to trust these self-signed certificates coming from our software. But only replace, like I said, there may be times you need to replace them. And just a note here is at 10.7, doing fresh installs of Portal for ArcGIS, ArcGIS Server, are HTTPS only now by default. It used to be HTTP and HTTPS. Now it's only HTTPS only. All right, so how do you go about updating the internal self-signed certificates for different ArcGIS Enterprise components? So let's first talk about Portal. Now, what I'm talking about here is the self-signed certificate that's being used to serve out port 7443, for example. Okay, so if you go to the Portal Admin API, there are tools that allow you to either, perhaps you need to import the root and intermediate certificates, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Import an existing server certificate or an existing properly signed certificate, as well as the ability to generate a new certificate signing request that you can use to have a certificate authority sign and then import the result of that signing process. So we support all of those operations within the portal admin. All right. So you can see here, if you go to the portal admin API, you can see some of the certificates, some of the, what the interface looks like, as well as some of the supported operations from the import root and intermediate to import existing, generate, that's the generate certificate signing request, and then a few other things that we'll take a look at here. Okay. So updating the internal certificate, one of the things to be aware of is if you are replacing the self-signed certificate with a properly signed certificate, you may be presented with it where you also need to import the root and intermediate of that CA. So just be aware that you may have to do that. Import root and intermediates when replacing the self-signed certificate. And also, there's a really handy thing here if anyone's ever gone through this at all. Something that was introduced at 10.6, there's a handy little button there that says do not restart the portal after import. So the reason that's there is some organizations or some networks may have to import, for example, federal government or DoD, may have to import many of their own intermediate or root certificates, where every time you do that, portal restarts by default. Well, if you got to import, let's say, 10 certificates, well, you don't want to have to go through 10 portal restarts to be able to import all of those, those root or intermediates. So you can check that box to not restart after each import, and then do it on the last one, so then you get a clean restart. And the reason that portal has to restart is in order to reread all those certificates and all the trust stores, it has to go through a restart, and that's the reason why it does that. Now with ArcGIS Server, it's actually very similar. It should look very similar the way Portal does. Again, it's in a slightly different location, but it's on the admin API under machines, the name of the machine, SSL certificates. Similar looking operations, generate, import root or intermediate, import existing. And there's, of course, it's using this, there's the self-signed certificate that it's using. Once you have a SSL certificate imported, such as a properly signed certificate, you would then navigate back to the machine name and then click update, and where it says self-signed certificate, you will replace that with the alias of the certificate that you just imported. And like I said, we're going to walk through a quick example of this to problem solve here in a minute. Again, you may have to import the root and intermediate certificates for your properly signed certificate in order for it to import properly. And the ArcGIS service will, also restart automatically as part of this process as well. Just in case you are curious, you can also update the internal certificate for the data store that's used on port 2443. There is not a UI to do that. There is not an admin API, but there is a command line tool that allows you to update that certificate. So you can basically do the same thing if you want to replace the self-signed certificate with a properly signed certificate as well. Okay. Just to note that we, starting with 10.7 and also at 10.8, we have some new server products. Those are Notebook Server, came along at 10.7. Mission server came along at 10.8. They also have their own internal web server certificates and individual ports, as you see there, 11.443 and 20.443. Their admin APIs, of course, are modeled and looks, much like ArcGIS Server admin API, so you can navigate to the machines and import and do a lot of the same SSL certificate operations there as well. Okay. Just a note on GeoEvent. GeoEvent, of course, server is co-located with ArcGIS Server, and it uses the same certificate that ArcGIS Server does. One thing to make note of is if you change the ArcGIS Server certificates, then the GeoEvent service must be restarted also to pick up that change. So if you want to restart the GeoEvent server, make sure you bounce or update GeoEvent server to use a different SSL certificate. Update ArcGIS server, but be sure you also bounce the GeoEvent server. And there's a note here that we've seen where sometimes it takes a couple times for a restart of that service for that to take effect. So just be aware of that. All right, so let's solve a particular problem. I think Craig presented this at the beginning of his workshop, where you may have an SSL situation where you're allowed to federate a server, but you're unable to then select and define the hosting server. And what causes that issue? So we're gonna walk through solving this problem right now. And the reason for this is it is an SSL problem, and it's because of a name mismatch. So we're trying to use a URL to ArcGIS server to the internal port where the name on that self-signed certificate, or that's whatever that certificate may be, is different than the URL that you are providing during the federation process. And name mismatches are bad as well. So let's figure out how to solve this particular problem. The reason for that is, like I said, the internal ArcGIS server certificate we're trying to tell Portal to federate and communicate with is a different name on the certificate. So we're going to walk through. Well, let's recreate this problem, and then let's solve it by we're actually going to generate a new internal self-signed certificate, or we could play the game of replacing it with a properly signed certificate. But we're going to put multiple DNS alias names on that certificate so that then there's a match. Okay. So the other thing here is troubleshooting tips and tricks is, and I'm sorry you can't see on the screen very well, but it's make sure you use the logs. Logs are really your friends here a little bit. So let's jump into a demo. Oh, here, yeah. Sorry about that. I had some animations going. But here's one of the typical SSL errors when you look at the logs. Is this PKIX or SSL certificate? This is one of the very classic log messages that lets you know that you have an SSL problem. So what we're going to do is basically create a new SSL certificate with that name, as well as put some additional DNS aliases on it, so that we would then be able to not only federate, but actually select it as a hosting service. Okay. So let's jump into a quick demo here for a moment. Okay. All right. So here's my ArcGIS Enterprise. So what I have here is a server that is actually an AWS instance, but this is a DNS alias, right? So let's pretend that I'm a portal administrator, my IT guy has set this up and said, hey, here's a DNS alias. You told me to install the software, so I installed it for you. So everything's good. All right, so as a portal administrator, you're like, oh, okay, now let me go do a few things that I know I need to do. The first thing I need to do is federate my ArcGIS server. All right, so all I know about at the moment is the name of this server, the name of this alias, right? I don't know any other really aspects at the moment in terms of what the AWS private DNS name of this machine is or anything like that. So I naturally are like, oh, okay, let me think. I need to add a server. And I know that it's the same DNS alias, it's an all-in-one installation. I know the web adapter is called server. Oops. And just kind of following this dialogue here, I'm going to say, okay, apparently I need to federate with 6443 ArcGIS. I need to give it the username and password that was the PSA of that ArcGIS server site. So I'm going to go type that in. Now I'm going to click add. And we're going to wait for it. Things should go okay here in a moment. All right, sure enough, it federated. So at this point, you think, oh, cool. Okay, so that worked. That was always, get a big step getting past that point. Like, all right, now I know that the data store is configured with that ArcGIS server, so I should be able to come here now and select it as hosting. And you notice that for some reason it's grayed out. And you have no idea why, and you're yelling at your IT guy, and the IT guy's like, "Hey, look, I did what you told me to do. It's feder, the data store is there. You don't really understand why it's happening." Okay, so here's how to troubleshoot this scenario to determine if you have an SSL problem. Let's go to Portal Admin and take a look at the logs. So I'm gonna go query the logs. I'll just do warning. And I had as I had in those slides. There's some log, key log messages to look for. And if you look at the most recent one right here, it's very interesting. It says URL 6443, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No subject alternative DNS name matching feddev.dev.geocloud.com. All right, so this is a SSL warning or error that basically says, hey, I'm trying to communicate to a URL that you told me, but the SSL certificate being presented back doesn't have that name on it. And this is a real no-no in terms of SSL certificates or, SSL, certificates. There's got to be a matching name. All right. So let's go look at ArcGIS Server for a moment just to see what it's presenting out as a certificate on 6443. So you can come here and we'll be able to see that the name of this machine is like some random AWS internal name. But then if we go to SSL certificates and look at the self-signed certificate, here's what is the CN, that name, as well as the DNS alias. So nowhere in this certificate does it know that it's supposed to be feddev.dev.geocloud.com. All right, and that's understandable. And this is a big SSL no-go, because what could be happening here is that in the world of SSL, there could be a man in the middle attack, or something like that, where it's trying to hijack by presenting a certificate that's not valid. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to generate a brand new internal SSL certificate. That basically has, good information on it. All right. So the alias here is, we're going to call this, new self-sign, like I've done this before. I'll leave the internal name on it. That's fine. No worries there. Organizational, I'll say, hey, I'm in Dev. I'm with Esri. I'm in Redlands, in California. I'm in the US. I'll create this certificate so it's good for 365 days. Excuse me. And then I'm going to actually use this subject alternative name area, where I'm going to give it 2 SANs. All right. The first SAN will be the name that's also the CN, but the second SAN will be the feddev.dev.geocloud.com. Okay. So I'm going to create a new internal self-signed certificate. All right, so we can go take a look at this guy. And sure enough, this will have 2 names on it now, 2 SANs, subject alternative names. And a subject alternative name says, hey, this certificate can be used for this name or this name. Either will be valid. All right, so that's cool. So the next thing you have to do is come back out to the machine. And because this right here, the web server is using self-signed certificate, I need to edit this to basically say, hey, use this other alias now. All right, so when you do this and change it, ArcGIS server, the internal Tomcat's going to restart. It has to, because you're basically saying, hey, don't use this SSL certificate, use this one, and it's going to bounce itself so it can do that reconfiguration. So this shouldn't take real long. If you refresh it a couple times, you can see that your web adapter will become non-responsive. That's okay. Don't get too freaked out. Tomcat's the internal Tomcat's just doing its thing and bouncing. So hopefully we'll do a few more refreshes here. Hopefully I didn't totally kill it. And it should come back up properly in a moment, I'm hoping, with the correct certificate. Let's keep waiting for it. Oops, sorry about that. Machines. Okay, and you can see that new self-signed certificate is now in place. That's cool. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to come back to here. I think if I can do a refresh, and what should happen now, if we go back to org settings servers, you can see that now this is highlighted so that I can select it. So changing that SSL certificate so that the internal URL matches the name actually solves this particular SSL problem. So we should be able to go ahead and now make this our hosting server. All right, so that's pretty cool. All right, so let's get back into our slides. I'm probably running a little longer than I need to be, and let's see if we can keep going. So we solved that particular problem. So the first part of this, or most of the bulk of what I just talked about, is how do you replace the internal self-signed certificates. The second half of this is how do we also import certificate authority root or intermediate certificates so that portal or ArcGIS server can trust external services, okay? So now let's say portal needs to talk out to an external service that has some, unique or different type of chain. Then how do we tell or give portal the resources to be able to make a trusted connection, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about now is how do we establish trust to external services, and we got a couple little examples there. So the way you do this is, I already mentioned it earlier, but you're going to utilize the import root or intermediate. So if you needed to talk to an external URL, and it had some like weird change, such as like some U.S. government certificates, those aren't automatically trusted by Portal. So you have to tell Portal, hey, import these root and intermediates so that you can properly communicate with this external root. And you do this, of course, through the Portal admin API as well. In ArcGIS Server, it's very similar. You would do the same thing. So how do we solve a problem here? So I think early right off the bat, Craig presented a problem where, hey, something's not working. There's no really good error message about why it may not be working, but we'll try to highlight how to fix this problem. So the particular example we're going to look at is the web server is protected by a DoD trusted chain, and that's not known to Portal ArcGIS out of the box, so to speak. So we're going to import that chain into Portal and establish the proper trust so it can, make this connection. We're going to actually load a WMS layer from, some website. Again, logs are your friend. We'll reiterate this a few more times. Your logs are keys to figuring this out. So we'll look at, a little bit of web traffic about why this doesn't work. You get a weird error message. So we will then go in and import those root and intermediates. Then we should be able to load a layer successfully. So let's quickly walk through this demo as well. All right. So I'm going to go to a map right now. So this is my portal. All right. And I have a URL over here on the other screen. I'm going to copy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the web tools just so we have something to look at here. So we'll come back to this in just a moment. So I'm going to go to add layer and I'm going to add a new WMS layer and I'm going to try to add that. And you're like, boom, right off the bat. Can't do this. Why is that? Well, many people get frustrated at this point. They think maybe the other server's down or doesn't work or there's something wrong with Portal. But it does take a little investigation to look at this a little bit more. So the first thing we want to look at is indeed that the Portal proxy is throwing an error. So what's happening is Portal on the back end via its proxy is trying to go out and talk to this WMS service. Your web browser is not trying to talk to this WMS service directly. It's Portal on the back end via a proxy. So this is where the trust comes in, where we need to allow Portal via importing these root or intermediates to be able to establish this trust. So how do we know that for sure? So let's go back and look at the logs again. All right, so let's do another query on the logs. And you will see a new error here. There's the URL we were trying to get to. And as I mentioned in a previous slide, this PKIX, this is another very classic SSL error, right? It's basically saying, I can't validate the certificate. I don't have the chain in order to properly validate this certificate, and it errors out. It won't even let you load it, okay? So this is where you need to start digging a little bit to make this work, okay? So in this case, Portal is trying to talk to this service. So we need to import that entire chain. You may say, well, what's the chain? I don't know what the chain is. Well, if you were to go to that URL directly, you can always go and look at the certificate and see the chain. So you see that this particular web server has 5 root and intermediate certificates that we need to import. And you may say, how do I import those? Well, anytime you're in a web browser like this, you can double click on one and say, hey, for this one, copy it out. And then for the other one, go to the details, copy it out. So you can copy each one out. You don't have to call somebody or email anybody. Copy it out and save it to disk. And I've already done that. And then I'm going to go to Portal Admin, and we're actually going to import those certificates here. So I'm going to go to Security, SSL, and I'm going to go to root to intermediate. Now I'm going to go through and start importing them. All right. Oops, I got to select a file first. Sorry about that. So let's go choose a file. And I'm over here on the other screen. Sorry about this. Let me scoot it over once I get to where I need to be. Give me 1 second. Sorry about this. All right, here we go. So I had these 5 certificates. It doesn't really matter the order. So I'm just going to start with going through these guys a little bit. I'm going to copy it, the name each one. So I'm going to use it. Oops. All right. Now, this is where this little checkbox becomes critical. You want to check that on each time because we got to do this 5 times. We don't want to wait for 5 restarts. All right. So we're going to import this guy. Let's do it again. Let's go choose another one. This guy. I'm going to copy this string so I don't have to type something. Check the box. I know this is very painful to watch, but it's necessary to get the job done. Let's get the next one. I forgot to copy that one, so I'll say DOD. Was that the? Yep, that's that one. Check the box. I'm afraid I'm going to forget to do that and waste some time here. Hopefully I'll do this right. Let's do this guy. Check the box. So that's the 4th one. Remember I said I had to do 5. Now it gets really fun. So now I'm going to choose the 5th one. And this time I'm going to say, give it a name, but I'm not going to check the box. And the reason is I want Portal to restart after this one. So I want all those certificates to be refreshed and Portal to come up and be successful. So I'm going to say import. and it will immediately respond. You're like, oh, okay, I must still have access to my portal or something like that. But if you give it just a couple minutes, and eventually you'll get the spinning thing here. So portal is now restarting itself. So this is always where it gets a little dicey, restarting portal during a live demo. So let's, and unfortunately, portal is not instantaneous in its restart. Typically, we might, during a live session, start to ask a couple questions at this point. But, oh, did it come back already? So let's see. Did we? Are we up? Are we up? All right. So that wasn't too bad. Actually, that was not too bad at all. So I'm going to come back to my home app now. And I'm going to refresh my map. Always good to just kind of refresh things. And now I'm going to come over here. And I'm going to try to go to that same URL again. Add layer from web. OGC. And now I'm hoping. Oh, we got something good going. So this is all the embassies. If my web tools is still open, let me see. Can we find where the proxy? This may have been out of date at this point because I didn't have it open at the correct time. But that's okay. So now this should have, well, it did work properly, which is great. I've loaded that layer. The proper trust, because we imported those certificates on the back end, that trust is there now, and everything worked great. So again, we were able to solve that problem using that. All right, so let's wrap this up. Let's get back into a few more slides, and let's wrap up this session here. There are just a few other things to be aware of. If you are way down into the SSL TLS world, we also allow you to change within portal and server and some of the other components. Which TLS versions you're using, we install only 1.2 by default now, but you can change that, as well as the cipher suites and things like that if you understand what those things mean. We also have a way in ArcGIS Online through a developer experience only that there are times when that you may want to import certificates to trust secured ArcGIS services or app proxies. They're only there for very specific purposes, but you can do that as well. And let's just throw this slide here. So if there is anyone out there that needs this capability, there is a way to accomplish that. And you can look at those links there for some more information. Key takeaways today is, hey, we've talked about SSL, right? SSL or TLS, it's all about secure, and I would even add the word there, trusted encrypted communication. You want to be secure, you want to be encrypted, but more importantly, you want to have proper trust so that information being received from a server you trust, and you can get your job done. SSL begins at the web tier and can extend all the way down into individual ArcGIS Enterprise components. So be aware of that from the web server. Remember that slot of all the touch points. Web tier is the easiest place to get started there. And hopefully the one thing you learned from the two little demos that I did are that portal and ArcGIS server logs are the key troubleshooting. Just because something's not working, dig a little deeper. If you don't have access to look at the logs, get with someone that does, because sometimes that's where SSL errors present themselves, is these kind of weird errors that will lead you to know what some actions you have to take from there. So that's the end of our Dev Summit session recording. Hopefully this is useful. Sorry we couldn't do it live this year, but I know that these are going to be available, and feel free to follow up, with any one of us if need be, if you have any questions in the future. Thank you very much, and have a good day.